Royal Assent. It's a reenactment of the Battle of Evesham, so it's a really colourful day. We've been wandering around, it's been lovely. I thought this was a great spot to read about the history of the Royal Assent from the Layman's Guide to the English Constitution by Albert Burgess. So I'll just carry on. The history of the Royal Assent. Thanks for tuning in. In the beginning, there was no parliament, but British kings were not dictators. They all used advisors. These advisors made sure the king did not rule outside the law. The Anglo-Saxon kings had the Witan, made up of the eldermen and thanes. Later, the Norman French kings had a parliament made up of barons and the knights from the shires. For a long time, Parliament met where the king was in the country, before it became settled at the Palace of Westminster. All our early kings and queens were in Parliament when it met, and were able to exert considerable influence on the actions of Parliament. The Stuarts believed they ruled by divine right, and we know what happened to them. King William III attended cabinet meetings and the House of Lords. Queen Anne, like William, attended cabinet meetings and the House of Lords. As a result, they both had a very clear idea of what was happening, both with government and in the country. Following the death of Queen Anne, we had King George I. He spoke only German, and because he had no idea what was being said, he attended neither cabinet meetings nor the House of Lords. This allowed the politicians to govern in his name, with the king having no say about what was being done in his name. His son, King George II, spoke English, but was discouraged by the politicians from attending cabinet meetings and the Lords. Indeed, he complained that his ministers were kings in his kingdom. He was effectively prevented from carrying out his role as king. King George III was badly educated. As a young man, he was given by the government tutors who tried to see that he imbibed Whig principles. Yet we see in a letter he wrote to his friend the Earl of Bute on the 25th of September 1758 that he was, in spite of his drawbacks and having a melancholy mind, that he did not want to just be a figurehead and a cipher for his ministers, and he determined he wanted to be king. He determined he would be king. His main interest being about farming, which he was knowledgeable. He also suffered from a mental ill health, and for a large part of his reign was not competent to govern. This gave the politicians, purely by accident, the idea that they could assume power without the sovereign having any say, or at most not much, in what government did. Yet when he became king, he kept up a 20-year fight for sovereignty to remain with him and not the House of Commons. After a heated debate in the House of Commons, King George III won the debate and established that he was sovereign and not the government, the Commons, by one vote. If Her Majesty did the same thing today, she would be lucky to get one vote. King George III took to appointing his own ministers, and those he appointed ran the House of Commons. By doing this, he was able to stave off the power of the Commons and retain his sovereignty in his own hands as king. It is this political power taken without permission, not authority granted under the law, that encourages governments to believe that those in the House of Commons can do anything they like, whether the sovereign or the people like it or not. This is the situation we have today. Goes on to talk about nationality. I know lots of people are asking on our group a lot of the time whether or not common law applies to them if they're from another country. So this is interesting interpretation of this. There's nationality. The best description of nationality was given by King Edward III in his statute 25E3 De Natis Ultra Mare. Edward ruled that everyone born under an English king is English. If you were born overseas of an English father, you were English. If you were born of an English mother and an alien father, you were alien. If an Englishman goes into the country of an enemy or into a friendly country and refuses to return to England on command of the king, the children born there are alien. Allegiance. Who owes allegiance to the king? First, everyone who is born under the king or who is born outside England to an English father. Second, those who accept English nationality. Third, anyone who comes to England to trade or otherwise comes under the protection of the king whilst they are here. So, for instance, a French merchant trading in England would owe allegiance to the king as long as he is in England. A French soldier, here as an invader, would owe no duty of allegiance to the king. A foreign prince who came to visit England would owe no allegiance to the king, but would require the king's permission to land in England. Everyone over the age of 12 was required to swear an oath of allegiance to the king. I remember at school being required to take the oath of allegiance. It is believed this oath-taking was started by King Arthur and goes back into the mists of time. The later acts of supremacy add to this, but do not replace the oath of allegiance. It is English common law that the king cannot resign his crown, nor can those estates in Parliament withdraw their homage. If the king was no king because he resigned, then those in Parliament were no Parliament if they withdraw their homage. If the throne were usurped, the rightful heir would still become king, though the usurper would be king in fact. Parliament has no right to take the crown from the next in line and appoint it another as a king. To do that would be to usurp the crown. The 1689 Declaration of Rights, made up of the representatives of the people, was able to remove the Stuart line because the will of the people is supreme over Parliament and the king. This last sentence again. The 1689 Declaration of Rights, made up of representatives of the people, was able to remove the Stuart line because the will of the people is supreme over Parliament and the king. So that's that section for now. We're at Parliament, Stockdale versus Hampstead. It does actually carry on talking on that subject of Parliament. It is Parliament sovereign, but we'll carry on like later in a different spot. Thank you for listening. There's a lot going on here today, so we're going to go and enjoy it.
Thank you.